Hello, I'm Peter Paul Fuchs, and I'm delighted to address you, those assembled for the first Festival of Apollo in Brasilia. This is a wonderful event, and we are grateful for all those who have supported it. Today I'm going to discuss my book, which has recently been published. Here it is, The Bull's Apron, The Aesthetic Theory of Masonic Art and Material Culture. We're very proud of this book, and we are very happy with the way it's been printed, and it really, because this subject deserved to be treated seriously, and that has happened. So I think what I'd like to do in discussing this book today, because the book exists now and you can consult it, and that's easy to do, I think it would be more interesting for me to give a sort of summary of it and give a sort of synoptic view of the issue relating to a lot of issues in Masonic praxis and history. I think that would be more interesting than just reading from the book, because you can read the book. But I want to emphasize that every point that I'm making is supported with sources and with theory and art historical exposition and argument in the book. So none of these points that I'm making are ones that are casually supported. They're all supported by art historical sources, and I want to emphasize that, and all I can say is please consult the book. But I think in terms of this presentation, I think it's more interesting just to give a sort of summary. So, one of the reasons that the whole issue of Masonic arts has been so difficult to assess is because it's really a success story in a way. There have been artists, great artists, some of the greatest artists that ever lived for humankind have been Masons, and they have made art that had something to do with Masonry. We think of Mozart preeminently in this regard. Mozart is probably the greatest Masonic artist ever, in the sense that here's a person who was obviously a great artistic genius, but who was also deeply committed to the ideals of the craft, and his music expresses that. Now, the question is how, and so I'm going to address Mozart a little bit from the first, just to make a point more broadly about issues in the book, and then we'll come right to my article on Mozart is actually included in this book as an appendix, and I think that's an important thing, because I allude to the issue of Mozart as being the preeminent example of a Masonic artist in the text of The Bull's Apron. And what I say is that, in a way, so much of what we're doing in trying to understand Masonic theory is to, in a certain sense, to make room for understanding the highest level of that, right? Which was someone like Mozart. Now, obviously, not everything in Masonic art and material culture was at that level, and that's obvious. But, so if you understand my point here, we have to, in a certain sense, in order to understand the more basic level of Masonic art, you first have to deal with the fact that Masonic art has been lucky to have such great artists involved, and in a certain way, because they were so great and so special, it's made it harder to understand the normal level of the Masonic arts and material culture. So that first we have to deal with that, the great artists. So, like I'm using Mozart as an example in this regard. The magic flute is the most famous Masonic issue with Mozart, and of course, everyone in the world thinks that the magic flute is just filled with Masonic this and that, secrets and so on like that. What's funny is that when you go back and you discuss what Masons actually thought of the magic flute in the Ars Quattro Coronatorum, the AQC articles from there and other places, what you discover is Masons actually said the magic flute, the story is not very indicative of Masonry, and so from your own lodge that a lot of what goes on in the magic flute, what does it have to do with? It has a lot possibly to do with the Egyptian rite of Count Cagliostro, but what it has to do with Masonry is another question. So here's an example of what I deal with in this book, of how in the fine arts, when Masonry was used, and I base this on the work of Scott Abbott in his book Freemasonry and the German Novel. He says he's discussing particular German novels, but I use his insight there to he says that there's an arbitrary usage and this has to do with the arbitrary nature of language itself, and he analyzes this, and I broadened his example there, his analysis, to use for all of the Masonic arts at the high level, for the Masonic fine arts. And this is in the first section of the book, where I elucidate the idea that it's the arbitrary nature usage of this that was the key for these fine artists. For instance, with Mozart, when it came to actually deploying supposedly Masonic themes in the magic flute, it really is in a very ad hoc and arbitrary way. Now, parentheses, by the way, that doesn't mean that the magic flute is not a deeply Masonic opera. It is very Masonic. But to get at that, you first have to let go of the idea that it's filled with all these little Masonic ideas, which is not really supported by what's actually there. You have to get down to the deep philosophical level of what it's about, and I do that in my Mozart article, which is in this book, that it represents, for instance, in the Men-at-Arms duet in the magic flute, there's a deep philosophical unity of religions with chant lines, with different aspects of musical culture which come into that duet, and I use that as representative of the unifying nature of Masonry in terms of religion. That's the level at which the magic flute was deeply Masonic, and that's sort of almost the deepest level, the bedrock level of what, at a high level, what Masonic art is. But if we analyze it aesthetically, what we get is something, and this is for pure analysis, we get that it was actually, Masonry was actually used arbitrarily by Mozart here, and it's a good example of it. Now, I use it in the book to say, okay, and I analyze the work of Dr. David Balajic of George Washington University, his great book on Washington Allston. I use that as a representative example, and it's a wonderful representative example that actually what Allston was doing was creating a very Masonic art, but once again, it shows this arbitrary usage of Masonry, trying to elucidate some culturally misunderstood points which were outside of Orthodox parameters, perhaps, and using Masonry symbolically. But here's the key point. What we see in this, when we analyze with Allston, is that this was not a clear representation of what Masonry was actually about in this period or any other period. So it's this arbitrary usage, and it's very fanciful in a way, and it relies on the genius of the artist. Okay, so now that's we've dealt with now. That's the fine arts. That's how the fine arts have been misunderstood, because people were thinking, well, Mozart was this, and this artist was that, and it seemed to go in a million different directions, and there was no coherent point to it. So now that's what the fine arts have been, and that's what the first section of the book is. And then I go in to discuss what is the objective nature, the clear nature of the actual aesthetic of Masonry based on its material culture, which we all know from our lodges and so on like that. And I'm just going to summarize that. Now, what we see in this is that, first of all, we look at Masonic arts, and they're very charming and they're lovely, and they're very charming and they're lovely, but they're not always. We can't say they're fine arts. We can't say they're great art. But we love them. They're beautiful and they have a certain edge to them. Where does this come from? And here's where it comes from. In the 18th century, a lot of people who were Masons, who were men of the city, they were also fancy country gentlemen, right? And they favored a kind of purposefully unsophisticated look, because they wanted to look like men of the country. And if you look in my book, we have a great photo in there of a statuette of King George dressed as a country gentleman, which I think is the ultimate proof that this analysis is right on, because if even the king had to dress as a country gentleman, it was an important trope. So that's the first thing, that Masons had this idea, because of this time they lived in, that it would be that there should be that the expressions they had should be purposefully unsophisticated, and that explains a lot about the way Masonic art looks, even though it came to be very refined after a while, even in the material culture as time went on. But in terms of the original impetus, that's what the analysis shows. And it also has to do with the fact that in that period, one of the most keen symbols for men was the bull symbol. And this goes back to the John Bull symbol, which later was used for up to like the 1950s in Britain, and it was actually created by a Mason, John Arbuthnot. So and that's where the title for the book comes from. And this was used in cartoons. You could see one of the cartoons of the 18th century period, and that's the bull. So it's the idea of masculine straightforwardness and not being so elegant, right? Then I go into a lot of the book is taken up with taking that idea and then understanding it by the prism of our great brother Hogarth, who was a great artist of the 18th century. And I'm not going to go into all that, because that's it's a wonderful part of it, and it's a very complicated part of it. And I encourage you to read it and get into Hogarth. But what I can say about it is he was a great artist of the period, and he used all these ideas to create his great art, and that we can use Hogarth's ideas to understand the Masonic fine arts in this way. The part I want to focus on with Hogarth is that in his great from his great series of arts, his great cycle, the Marriage a la Mode series, the marriage contract painting and then the Rippenhausen engraving of the marriage contract shows something so fascinating. And this is a little bit complicated, but I'll just summarize it. The the view outside of the window in this painting shows a very odd building, and this view, we know that there have been similar type views used in Masonic almanacs and lists, that this was meant in a very Masonic way. In fact, there's one scholar, Suliedetis, she shows that this is actually similar to Solomon looking out the window and holding a rigid placard. So we know that, and he's looking at the temple, so we know this was meant in a very Masonic way. What is the view out the window? It's as Lichtenberg, one of the commentators, says, it's the building is a horror, right? The building is a total it's a total horror. And Hogarth is very funny in this way. Like the windows don't match. This part of the building doesn't match with the other part of the building. Some windows are triangular. I mean, it's very funny. We have a detail of that so you can see, and the look of the person, the lawyer looking out at the building is very funny. So, but what's the point of this Masonically? The way I interpret this, and this goes back to the Masonic, is that Masonry's aesthetic is all about humor, right? It's all about accepting humor as the basic idea. And this is why Hogarth is so representative of Masonic ideals in this way. And what does that building represent? That in terms of Masonic terms, it represents your brother in the lodge. Your brother, I mean, with respect, your brother might be a horror in some ways. He might be a real problem. And what is specifically Masonic about the insight here is that Masonry is unique in teaching that tolerance, that we accept each other, even sometimes, even though your brother might be a horror sometimes, we accept each other, and we laugh at each other, and we have fun with it, and that's a good way of dealing with life. That's something that has really been a contribution of Masonry, and you can see this in politics and everything like that. And I got to tell you, in my personal opinion, I think one of the reasons that politics is such a mess is because that there's not enough Masonry behind it. These political factions, they don't know how to relate with each other. You don't relate with each other by saying, "Oh, I love you, I love you." You relate with each other by having some sort of a way of dealing with each other when you're a horror, and the other person, your political partner, might be a horror, and then but you learn to accept him, and this is what Masonry teaches. And so this idea of humor at the basis of the Masonic arts is something that I go through in a very complicated way in the book, and you can read it all there. And it's all explained very carefully. And what it comes down to is that in the actual material culture, what we're actually seeing is what I call comic deism or deism, from the deistic mindset of the 18th century. And now it's very important to understand that 18th century Masons were mostly not deists. The Catholic Church condemned Masonry for being a deistic organization, and it's not supported by the actual facts of the lives of people who were involved in Masonry. So most Masons were actually very orthodox religionists, but their only difference is they believed in tolerance. So, and part of the tolerance was tolerance for deists. So this is what I'm saying, is that the Masonic material culture has this deistic, kind of comic deistic comedy about it, which is very elegant, and that is what's being represented in the material culture. Now, let me just end by saying that this playfulness at the heart of Masonic material culture does not mean, and you can read the book clearly, does not mean that it was not serious. It was extremely serious, and you can see this by the comparison with Hogarth. Hogarth was trying to teach some serious lessons about life, just like Masonry does. So it's not the sort of modern humor like ha ha he he, or like, make fun of each other just to cut each other down. It's humor at the deepest level, at the 18th century level, and that's what went forward. And, I'll just end by saying this was such a complicated matter that a lot of things happened later. I go into the analysis later. This whole notion of 18th century comedy that is so elegantly presented in the material culture, this had a lot of changes later, and you can read in the book some of them. I mean, in the Victorian era, it changed and became something different. It became very pious and religious, and one of the best examples from William Moore's book on Masonic temples, I think, which is just an amazing piece of proof, is that Masons were buying church furniture. There are catalogs which show they were buying the exact same furniture for their lodges that was offered for churches. So, somehow this initial comic or, elegant comedy of Masonry later got transmogrified into a very, pious and, overly religious thing, which is not what Masonry is about. I'm not saying Masons are deeply religious people, but Masonry itself is not a religion, and to treat it as a religion is a bad thing, because it plays into the hands of anti-Masons, and it also obscures the great lessons that Masonry can teach. And so one part of the book, which some people may find very interesting, is that what I do is I show how, because of this basic playfulness within the Masonic ethos, somehow some people eventually used it for purposes that Masonry never would have condoned. And one of I think the most striking ones is that the Italian fascists and communists of all sorts, except the Maoists, somehow, because they used Masonic tropes, and a lot of propaganda art is arguably based on Masonic graphic designs and so on like this. And I briefly, what I say is that this has to do with the fact that that first of all, Walter Gropius, who was a great significant influence on all sorts of communist artists from the Bauhaus, he actually explicitly said he was basing his art on the operative Masonic lodges and so on like that. And also the fact that in many irregular Masonic bodies, people who later went on to careers as graphic artistes in the communist world, they were members of irregular lodges. So I speculate this is how it happened. But anyways, the way I close the book is simply this, that we are really heirs to a wonderful tradition. It's a beautiful tradition. We should celebrate it and remember it. That this wonderful, charming tradition of humor and serious humor and ways to get along with your brother based on understanding him with humor and not condemning him this is something to be celebrated. We should remember it. And there are artists today, like Peter Waddell, for instance, here in Washington, who had a show at the White House, even for the White House, who use Masonic art. So it's not people who use the exaggerative and notions of Masonic art and beautifully done to create something good. So there is a flourishing tradition that we have. It's a historical tradition. It is a vintage tradition. We should treat it with respect. We should honor its special kind of humor and its special wisdom for all of us to appreciate and to celebrate our craft. Thank you very much.